Hello and welcome to this game review. In this one, we'll talk about a few themes, especially about thinking of our opponent's resources, and also a little bit about the endgame and the endgames about opposite colored bishops, as there was a lot of chaos at the end of this game. So, it started as some opening. We have the Kalashnikov variation, and the issue with this opening is these two squares, right? Specifically d5. White has to understand that now this square is extremely weak, and this should be the focus of his play, so the knight should go towards this square slowly. Problem with knight b3 is now this knight is extremely far away from d5. If a knight is two squares diagonally away from a square, it means it will take him 4 moves to get there. In theory, for example, like this, here, 4 moves. So we should go closer, and closer is knight b5. Firstly, this creates the threat of knight d6, which would occupy the knight square on d6, and will take the bishop pair. And for example, after d6, we can even play c4 to clamp down on this square. Eventually, the knight will go to d5, where it will be very strong. Okay, knight b3. Now both sides develop the pieces. This is all fine. And here we get to this position, h3, bishop h5. Now white plays bishop d2. And why is this a mistake? Well, the opponent showed us very quickly why this was a mistake. So black played knight e4. So how should we avoid mistakes like this? Well, I guess white, of course, has his ideas of playing bishop e3, maybe c3, stuff like this, to start playing on the queen side, probably. But before implementing our ideas, we should always think about what forcing moves the opponent has. So before making any move, we must imagine that we have made it and think about the opponent's checks, captures, and attacks. So let's imagine this move. What checks does he have? Well, there's one check, queen f2, but that's no problem. Captures, well, after bishop d2, there's this, the same queen f2, not much else. So all of these are okay. The attacks, what can he attack? Well, he can always attack the queen, either by taking here or with knight d4. Right? So we should always keep this in mind. At the moment, knight d4 wouldn't be an issue because we can take with the bishop. The knight is pinned, so we can't take with the knight. After this, now we didn't see the opponent's attack on the queen, and this uses the pin as well. This is extremely unpleasant. Queen e3. And black plays knight takes f3, which makes sense, but more precise was taking with the bishop, because now the knights can use these newly created weak squares, specifically f4, and the very instructive move here is knight h5, going towards this newly created outpost on f4. And the reason this is such a good square is because white will never be able to control the square with a pawn, which means only the bishop can take the knight here, and if black wants, he can put 2 knights there, one on e6, one on f4, so that if the bishop takes, another one can go there. This knight will be extremely strong, especially since this king is over here and it is quite weak. But okay, this happens and black makes the positional mistake of exchanging queens like this, and here black should keep the queens on the board because white's king is a lot less safe. So an attack is more likely to happen to this king than to this one. Okay, now white's structure is straightened out, and now it's not that bad because the f4 square is protected, and this bishop is absolutely useless as it's attacking f3, but it's easily defended. On g6, it would attack e4, which is also easily defended. So after rook fd8, white plays a very big positional mistake, which is f4. It's even a blunder, according to the computer. The problem with this move is now, firstly, this has no threat, right? When we go here, we have to have some kind of idea as to why we're playing the move, right? So what's the point? Are we going to take here? Well, let's say black skips a move and we take. We haven't really achieved much. We have only improved the opponent's structure, and now we are left with 2 isolated and weak pawns here. Otherwise, are we playing f5? Well, if there were queens on the board, we could try to attack somehow on the king side. But here we're not really going to attack. And now we have weakened this square, and black can even strike in the center with d5, start opening up his rooks, and the pawns will just become weaknesses. So instead, white should try to open up the position for his bishop pair. which is white's advantage here. The bishops are clearly looking at the queen side, so something like a4 comes to mind, simply trying to take the pawn here. And if black takes, we can now activate the rooks through the a file, and this pawn on a6 should drop down, and then we will have an easy plan to push the b pawn to queen. And after f4, e4 is very weak, and now playing something like this is less likely because the bishop has to guard the pawn on e4. Now bishop e1, f5, so now knight c5 and bishop b4. So this move shows that white is not really calculating his opponent's threats. So at this point, black had a threat. He didn't realize it, but he did have a threat. If white makes a random move, black will take, white will recapture. And then, well, one of the threats is to simply invade with the rook, but the other threat was this forcing move, bishop e2, attacking the rook and the pawn. We'll have to lose the pawn. And at the end of this, we will also lose e4 and likely f5 as well, as the base of the pawn chain has been destroyed, so the other pawns will become extremely weak as well. So this was an extremely big threat, which black did not play, bishop e2. But here black would be more or less winning because he is taking at least 2 pawns, and maybe even more. Now f6 is played, and now white defends from this. And we get this interesting endgame. We get the move d4, which makes sense as there's not much other use of this doubled pawns. Black takes, which helps our structure. And a few moves later we exchange one rook, and we get to this position after h6. So now white is better because he has a clear target on d6. And also he has the potentially better rook because he has the c file, more or less. He can play rook c3 and b3, move the bishop away, and then use the c file as he did in the game. Also, he has the kind of better king, and he has slightly more space with this pawn on f5. The right idea here would be to bring the king, as happened in the game, and then play d5 at some point, because this will restrict this bishop very strongly. And when we have an opposite colored bishop situation, if we want to win, we want to put the pawns on the color of our opponent's bishop, not our own, because this way we will firstly fix pawns on dark squares, which means they will be easily attacked. Now this rook cannot go to the c file because of this pawn. Secondly, it creates a barrier against the opponent's bishop. Now, for example, this bishop has lost this diagonal. It cannot go on this diagonal either. He has this diagonal, but there's not much to do there. So here, after d5, white has the simple plan of invading with the rook. And with the more active rook, white should be winning. The king is also very actively placed. But h4 is a bit of a useless move, simply pushing a pawn. But with every move that we make, we should have a purpose. So now h5, also kind of a useless move. And now bishop c3. And this doesn't really make much sense unless we're playing for e5. But e5 would simply allow black to get rid of his weaknesses. So instead, again, d5 and go here, fixing the weakness and then attacking the weakness, which is a very typical strategy in endgames. But now rook e8, king f4, so the king is very well involved. This is a good idea. King h7, black's king is going further from the center. And now bishop b4, rook d8 again, rook c3. Now white takes the c file, rook c6 is played. This does allow d5, so this is because the pawn was not fixed. If we had fixed the pawn on d6, not allowing it to move anywhere, it will be a very easy target. Now rook c6 and just take it. Not to mention this pawn can also be taken. And after we win a pawn, we can create a passed pawn here as well. Also, we will probably not trade rooks, as opposite colored bishop endgames tend to be very drawish. But if there are rooks on the board, then it's a whole different matter, especially when our rook is much more active. So now d5 is played, and white plays rook d6, which is a very, very big mistake. Firstly, trading rooks, which will give us an equal endgame, because with no material advantage, opposite colored bishops, there's no real plan to play for a win. And also white missed this move, as you mentioned, e5, I'm not sure why you missed this, because, well, after all, in the endgame we must create passed pawns. How else are we going to win? And white has improved all of his pieces to the maximum. They're very well placed. And now we can just play e5, threatening e6. He can take. He kind of has a passed pawn, but it is easily handled. Now we have the simple plan of playing e6. The king can go further, and the rook can even take more pawns. And this should be very easily winning. This king is also out of play. So a very big miss by white here. Instead rook d6, and now we get this endgame. And the reason it's equal is because black can blockade on the d7 square at some point, well, if he brings the king, and we will not really be able to push the pawn further than d6. So here black finds this idea to perpetually attack these two pawns, which are also now weaknesses, after black got exchanged these pawns. So white tries to play for a win. He is a pawn down, but he does have a passed pawn. But again, this shouldn't really work out. And at this point, even black is better. If white continues to play for a win and try to, for example, win the bishop with d7, by that point, black's pawns will be so far advanced that he can just give up the bishop, and these pawns will not be stopped along with the king. Black is going to win. So already this is quite risky. So at some point white should just make the draw, and making the draw should be quite easy at this point. Here, if black wants to continue, he can go here, but neither side is really playing for a win. So now we get this endgame, and now white plays this move b4, which is a very bad move because now white doesn't have any flexibility on the queen side, which means his only pawn break is a4, and that could be easily stopped with the bishop going to this diagonal, while black has this passed pawn. So at the moment white is blockading it, but black has the idea of going all the way to this pawn, picking it up because there's no one defending it, and then creating a second passed pawn by playing a5 at a good moment. This way he will have two passed pawns, and this will be enough to win the game. So bishop e6, and this kind of happens, but the other way around. White wants to take this pawn and play a4, which works in the game, but this shouldn't really work because black has the simple idea of putting the bishop on a4, after which white will have no counterplay on the queen side, while black will win white's bishop with the g pawn. So this is played, and at this point black should play bishop c2, and after this bishop a4, and the game should be over in black's favor because he will win this bishop for the pawn. Then he will go back with the king, take this pawn, take that pawn, and this one will queen. But somehow white manages to win this. So at this point, of course, white should lose it because he can exchange the last pawn for the a pawn, and black tries to kind of play for a win. But at this point, white has the only chances to win because, of course, black can't win with just the bishop. And now the only winning move, drawing move is bishop e4, which is not entirely simple. The point being after b6 to play bishop b7, because if any other move, king e6 would be played, which would prepare b7. And similarly to the game, white will be left with a pawn up with an easy win. But after bishop b7, white is forced to move the king around, which gives black enough time to bring his own king, and instructively, black makes the draw. Now after b7, he can take, and king c4. So quite a long variation, but this was important to find. And or of course, black would just take here first, as this is probably the easiest draw. And neither side can win here. This should just end more or less like this. But okay, g1, and now white is in time because after this, king a6 is played, and we get this pawn endgame, which is an easy win as the king is very well placed. So quite an interesting game, and there's a lot of things to discuss here, especially in the endgame. So hopefully this was useful, and see you next time.